In this video, I want to introduce you to the four biological molecules and spend some time talking about carbohydrates and lipids. Biological molecules are large molecules that are essential for life. They have four main roles. They provide energy that allows organisms and cells to do everything they need to do. Biological molecules are part of the structures in living organisms. They are very important in helping the chemical reactions that are metabolism that sustain life. And they also are where genetic information is stored so that organisms can reproduce individual cells or entire organisms. Biological molecules can also be known as biomolecules, which is the word I tend to use, macromolecules, which might sound familiar for those of you that are up to date on current nutrition programs, or organic molecules. All biological molecules are built from carbon, and carbon is important because it can form single, double, or even triple bonds to make molecules of many different shapes. And when it comes to living organisms, the shape of the molecule really is important for the function of that molecule, and of course the function of the molecule is what allows life to keep happening. Biological molecules or biomolecules are polymers. They are made up of repeating smaller molecules that are known as monomers. So each of these individual biomolecule has its own unique monomer. Living organisms get their biomolecules from the food that they eat, or in the case of things like photosynthetic plants, they produce some of that food themselves. And then these living organisms take that food and use various digestive processes to break down the big polymers into the small monomers that then can be absorbed into cells that can be used to build new polymers from the pieces. Because, of course, you may eat a hamburger, but you are not a hamburger, so the protein in that hamburger has to be turned into protein that's useful for your body. There are two main processes that are used over and over again in this the flow chart of taking big polymers and breaking them down and building new polymers. Hydrolysis is how we break these polymers apart inside cells, and then dehydration synthesis is how things are put together to build new molecules. And water is very important in both of those processes, which is why water is something that is essential for life as we know it. So I said there are four groups of biological molecules. The first one I'm going to talk about today is carbohydrates, and you might be familiar with this term because, of course, you get it from food. So if you are familiar with what's in your food, you may have heard of carbs before. Lipids, which is sort of the scientific word for fats and oils, are the second group of biological molecule. Proteins are the third, and I'll talk about them in a separate video. And the last one is nucleic acids, which also will be in that second video. So let's talk a little bit about carbohydrates. Commonly, we call these things sugar, starch, and fiber. Carbohydrates are made of three different kinds of elements, three different types of atoms: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So you can think of the word CHO to remember what's inside carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are a way to store and release quick energy, so they are an important energy source for the cell and for living organisms. They also can provide dietary fiber. If they are not able to be digested, they can do other things in the body that are equally important for health. Carbohydrates provide structural support in some organisms. So the cellulose in plant walls is actually a carbohydrate. It's one that to humans is a dietary fiber. It's something we can't digest, but it's very, very important in giving that plant stability and allow it to stand up away from Earth's gravity. And then another carbohydrate known as chitin is found in fungus and also in the exoskeletons, the outside skeleton of insects, and it gives it this tough, strong nature as well. Carbohydrates are a polymer, so the monomer of carbohydrate is known as a monosaccharide, or one sugar, mono meaning one. We also just call that a simple sugar. There are four main monosaccharides: glucose, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about when we get to photosynthesis and cellular respiration; fructose, which you may have heard of in high fructose corn syrup that's used as a sweetener in many processed foods; and then galactose, which is not something that you're probably going to ever run into if you're not working in science. So these simple sugars, these monosaccharides, are the form of the carbohydrate that can be broken down for quick energy. Anything larger than the monosaccharide is actually a storage form, but it's a storage form that can be very quickly accessed. Monosaccharides also can exist as a long chain, as we have over here in this diagram, or as a ring. And these, if you count up your carbons, hydrogen, and oxygens, these two molecules are exactly the same. They are both glucose, but depending upon the environmental conditions, you might have glucose as a straight chain molecule or as a ring. So these different categories of carbohydrates, I've alluded to them a little bit. Monosaccharides and disaccharides are what we tend to taste as something sweet in our food, and they are the source for quick energy. Monosaccharides are used directly, and disaccharides are quickly digested to become two monosaccharides that can be used for energy. Carbohydrates that are slightly larger, 3 to 10 monosaccharides put together, get known as an oligosaccharide, and these are part of various cell structures with various functions in living organisms. So they're not necessarily broken down for energy, but they are part of structure. Even in humans, they are very important in many cell processes. And then the polysaccharide is many monomers linked together into a long chain. So starch that you find in potatoes and in grains, oatmeal, that is a way that these carbohydrates are storing the energy. It is just many, many glucose monomers hooked one after the other, and again, very easy to digest back down to that monosaccharide. In animals, we don't store our excess carbohydrates as starch. We store it as glycogen. In humans, the liver is the place where glycogen is primarily stored. And it's a molecule very similar to starch. It's just a long, more of a branched chain, but a large molecule that's made up of glucose. And then cellulose, I already mentioned, is a polysaccharide found in plant cell walls. And it is another many pieces of many monosaccharides hooked together. They are just attached in a way that we are not able to detach in digestion, which is why cellulose becomes a dietary fiber, something that can't be digested. So speaking of digestions, polysaccharides are digested by hydrolysis, which is basically the polymers are split apart by sticking a water molecule in between two of them. So you have two, you pull off that monosaccharide by pushing a water in there. Sugar and starches are digested into monomers, as I mentioned, for quick energy. Excess monomers of carbohydrates can be assembled by dehydration synthesis into carbohydrate polymers for storage or lipid polymers for even longer term storage. Lipid, of course, is the scientific word for fat. So excess carbohydrates can become fats if you've used up all of your space for storing carbohydrate in the organism's body. The polysaccharides that cannot be digested by an organism become known as dietary fiber. And these are important for humans at least because the fiber helps feed the bacteria that live in our gut, primarily in our large intestine. And in some animals that live on the cellulose and other polysaccharides that are similar, things that you think of grazing animals or browsing animals, they actually are not eating the grass and digesting it. They can't digest it any more than we can in their stomachs, but they have so much bacteria inside their intestinal systems. The bacteria digest the grass and turn the grass into smaller molecules that then the animal, like my goats, can actually eat and get the nutrients from it. In humans, fiber also is important for controlling certain substances in the blood and helping to keep fecal matter moist to prevent constipation. Lipids is the second main category of biological molecules I want to talk about, and just like carbohydrates, it's composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Just the proportions are slightly different than in carbohydrates, which is why you've got very different characteristics of lipids or fats as compared to carbohydrates or sugars. In lipids, we have four main categories. We can have fats, oils, waxes, and steroids. Those are all lipids. They are not water-soluble. They are all something that will not dissolve in water. The functions of lipids are to provide a place for long-term energy storage, and I think you're already aware of that fat is a way to store energy on the body. And something like this polar bear over here in the picture, certainly going to provide their stores for the winter by putting on lots of body fat. Lipids are also part of the cell membrane, so that's an essential role. Lipids provide insulation and protection to many parts of the body in larger animals. You have fat behind your eyeballs, for example, to help provide some soft cushioning in case your head gets shaken around. And certain hormones, which are chemical messengers inside the body, are lipid-based. And so in order to make the hormones, the lipids are needed. Lipids are very diverse. We've got 4 different categories: fats, oils, waxes, and steroids. And so we don't have a true monomer the way we do with our carbohydrates, where really you break everything down to either glucose, fructose, or galactose. But all lipids have at least one fatty acid chain, and so that can be considered the monomer of lipids. You will find a fatty acid chain in anything that is a lipid. A fatty acid basically consists of a long hydrocarbon chain, which is hydrogen and carbon. So you can see we've got hydrogen and carbon here in a chain formation, just a long line of carbons with hydrogen attached to it. And then at the end, we have a carboxyl group, or a carboxyl acid group. That's carbon double bonded to oxygen and also bonded to a hydroxyl group. And you had an activity where you were circling those carboxyl groups in your functional group worksheet. So hopefully this looks somewhat familiar to you. And so the fatty acids will come in different sizes of the chain and different arrangements of bonds. Sometimes there's double bonds in there, not just single bonds between the carbons. But this is sort of the basic setup of what's the most common feature of a lipid. So let's talk about these different types of lipids. Fats and oils are the first category. I'm just going to put them all together because they both are made of triglycerides. And we eat a lot of things that are fats and oils. The triglycerides are those edible fats. Triglycerides are made of 3 fatty acid chains attached to a glycerol molecule. So that's what this diagram is in the upper right, just an illustration. And again, remember this zigzag is just a way to show that there's a carbon at every one of those points with hydrogens filling in as needed to make 4 bonds for each carbon. So that's how you interpret this diagram. The triglycerides can contain either saturated or unsaturated fatty acid chains, and that has to do with whether the carbons have all single bonds, as we have in this first example, or if there are some double bonds, like we see in the middle of this unsaturated fatty acid. So saturated means basically full of hydrogen, and the unsaturated fatty acid could have more hydrogen added if we broke that double bond. If a fat or oil contains mostly saturated fat, then it becomes solid at room temperature. So most saturated fats, such as the butter that I have down here as an illustration, they're coming from animals. So animal fats in general are mostly saturated. Not every single fatty acid in that food will be saturated, but the majority of them are. And then if a fat or oil contains mostly unsaturated fat, then it will basically be liquid at room temperature, and these tend to be primarily our plant fats. So we've got a bottle of vegetable oil here. It's probably soybean oil, potentially safflower, corn oil, or canola oil. Those are all plant fat oils. Trans fats, which you may have heard about in the news, is basically something that people can make in a factory by adding hydrogen to an unsaturated fat and turning it into a saturated fat. Trans fats helped in preserving food longer for the shelf, but then they more recently were linked to heart disease and diabetes, and there's been a push to remove them from processed foods to get them out of the American food supply. Fish is another animal product that actually has more unsaturated fat in it. You may have heard of omega-3 fatty acids, which is a particular kind of unsaturated fatty acid found primarily in fish and is also something that can be good for health. So just like with carbohydrates, fats and oils are digested by hydrolysis. They're being split apart by adding a water molecule and take the fatty acids off the glycerol. And then they can be combined with cholesterols and proteins to form things called lipoproteins in order to allow fat to be carried through the bloodstream. Because fat doesn't mix with water and your blood is basically water, we have to use a lipoprotein to allow them to be transported. The lipoproteins come in various sizes, so if you've heard about LDL, low-density lipoprotein, or HDL, high-density lipoprotein, you know that there is a relationship between how much of those you have floating in your blood and your potential risk for heart disease. But they aren't, they are essential. We have to have lipoproteins to carry fats around your body because you do need a certain amount of fat. Fatty acids are used by cells for growing and repairing essential structures. Remember, they're an important part of the cell membrane. Fats can then be assembled into hormones or in steroids or repackaged in adipose tissue, which is fatty tissue in the body, for the insulation of body parts, for protection, as I mentioned, your eyes, and also for long-term energy storage. So in the cell membrane, the lipids are something known as phospholipids, where you have two fatty acid chains and then a phosphate group on that third one. So it's set up very similar to a triglyceride, but instead of 3 fatty acid chains, there are only 2, and that third place is taken up a phosphate group, or a PO4 group, like you remember from your functional groups worksheet. The fatty acid part repels water, that's known as being hydrophobic, whereas the phosphate group attracts water, or it's comfortable in water, so it's hydrophilic. And so you end up with the cell membrane being something known as a lipid bilayer. I see my picture is kind of shifted a little bit, but this is lipid bilayer is the word there, where the phosphate groups are on the outside of the 2 layers. One of the outside is facing the inside of the cell space, or the intracellular space. The other side is the outside of the cell, or the extracellular space. Then these last 2 types of lipids, waxes and steroids. Waxes are made by both plants and animals. Beeswax or something, you're probably familiar with, made by animals. Many plant leaves, like the magnolia tree or evergreen trees, have a waxy coating for protection. And of course, you produce earwax yourself. So waxes are another type of lipid. And then the 4th category of lipids are steroids, which include cholesterol, which is part of the cell membrane and involved in transporting fats in the blood, as I already mentioned. And hormones. The sex hormones are lipids. They are steroids. Estrogen and testosterone are examples of steroid hormones, which depend on these lipids to be able to be produced. And that finishes my overview of these first 2 biomolecules, carbohydrates and lipids. The next video will cover proteins and nucleic acids.